you're automatically marginalized by that system, both you and the space, and you're going to be fighting for resources in a way that a profit-generating enterprise doesn't. The concept of highest and best use is related to the idea that any given physical space, any given piece of land has some use that will generate the most revenue, both for some enterprise and for the city. And there's a lot of pressure in cities to move land towards that highest and best use, which is often directly opposed to quality of life. A lot of the things that we conceive of as generating quality of life, whether it's parks or museums, useful public transportation, social services, cultural programs, from a capitalist mindset, they're either an overly expensive drain on resources, or they're things which could be better provided by private enterprise, and should be because they could be. Basically that because some private enterprise could make money doing that, they should be allowed to. The time scale that capital operates on has an interesting effect on all this too. Enterprises run on quarterly results. If they're lucky and they're far thinking, maybe they're looking to maximize profit in a 5-year window. Whereas the kinds of things which generate quality of life come into being slowly, they're created slowly, they take time. Enterprises are generally quite willing to work against those things for short-term profit, even if they're things like, say, worker education that will create more profit in the long term. Because they're driven by short-term profit, they can't work in that mindset very easily. So if a municipality does want to create those kinds of things, they're forced to do so without any corporate support, as opposed to things like tax incentives, which they get direct corporate support for and corporate lobbying for. The idea of coercive efficiency is a notion which has come into being with globalization. When you have, a dozen cities around the world, 100 cities around the world that are competing against each other, if one city decides, oh, well, we don't actually need parks, so we're not going to spend money on them, that creates pressure on everyone else to get rid of theirs too, because they have to try to be as competitive as those other spaces. So there's this kind of universalizing downward pressure on quality of life to, try and steal business from some other city, or to, retain the enterprise that you have. In a historical mindset, some of the things which have caused major change have been cities trying to control the working class and working class dissatisfaction, and to provide an outlet for capital. Capitalist societies accumulate capital in the owning class. This capital has to go somewhere eventually. It's expensive. You can't really have it just sort of sitting around. So you need things which can sink very large amounts of capital. One of the things historically that's been done with this is large urban renewal projects. Haussmann in Paris in the 1850s was kind of one of the first really large examples of this, where he, under Napoleon, tore up huge sections of the city that he considered slums, which were basically just the working class neighborhoods of medieval Paris. He routed boulevards through there, which were designed so that you could move troops quickly in the city to suppress rebellions, and it cost a whole lot of money and put a lot of that excess capital to work. So while this is kind of necessary in capitalist cities, it also creates this very large-scale urban destruction. This still goes on if you look at like London with the Olympics projects that are going on. I mean, it's smaller scale and they have better PR, but it's the same kind of thing. Zoning laws and suburbanization are another really interesting effect of capital. With the invention of first the streetcar and then the car, and specifically the autobus, cities suddenly became suburban, and it became possible to have some of the class barriers around locality in the city break down, that all of a sudden it wasn't guaranteed anymore that your nice rich neighborhood was only going to have people of your class in there because other people could afford to drive in there. And as buildings got taller, all of a sudden there was the issue that, well, maybe somebody's going to put up a 10-story apartment building right next to your house. And this can lead to kinds of class desegregation which were considered unfavorable. So zoning laws suddenly showed up. They first appeared in Germany in the 1870s. They spread to America by 1910 or 1911 or so, and were pretty much ubiquitous in most of the Western world by the 20s. They acted to enforce that kind of class segregation. They, to some degree, acted to prevent things that were considered public nuisances, like noxious factories being built near residential districts. But there'd been a whole set of nuisance laws that were in existence before zoning that had pretty much dealt with that same kind of issue, but they weren't powerful enough to deal with the class segregation issue. The other thing that drove zoning laws was capital preservation. Developers in these new suburbs were trying to encourage people to put all of their money into single investments, into owning a house. They needed to be able to try and convince people that that investment was going to retain value. So zoning laws became a tool of capital preservation. When the progressive left finally started challenging these laws, other tactics showed up. We ended up with open space preservation laws, which are actually a tactic to prevent more development. In a lot of cases where the kind of class segregational zoning laws have been ruled either unconstitutional or cannot be upheld for some reason, cities have decided, oh, well, if we can't control the zoning in the way we want, we just won't allow any new development. Homeowners associations are another thing. Specifically in the US, I don't know how prevalent they are in Europe, when they couldn't get enough enforcement out of zoning laws for details like, paint color uniformity and that kind of thing, you had developments starting to be created with homeowners associations that could enforce much more rigorous strictures as part of the sales contract. Selective enforcement of the type that's common among law intended for social segregation is built into zoning law with the concept of variances, where if a project is considered important enough for the city, almost any of the zoning laws can be selectively waived. A lot of cities will create schemes of incentives around, if you build us this kind of public space, we'll let you build a taller building or whatever. So then the developer builds a public space, but they don't actually have any incentive to make that public space livable. They really don't want people using that space. So they'll create these empty plazas in front of high-rises that are designed to not be friendly places to stay. Or they'll create an actually nice place and make it appear as private as possible. It may be legally open space, but they really don't want people from the street coming in there, and they enforce that architecturally. Gentrification has been another fallout of capital. After World War II, we saw a lot of flight from the urban cores, both from deprivation and both damage and lack of upkeep to the urban core, lack of accommodation for cars. The cars simply don't fit in urban cores very well. So a lot of people moved out to the suburbs. In America, the GI Bill pushed this a lot, as it gave a lot of people who wouldn't have otherwise bought into houses the opportunity to buy in, which left the urban core with basically the people who couldn't move out left in it. In the 50s and 60s, we got what are kind of epithetically termed urban pioneers moving back into these neighborhoods because they found that, these were actually pretty nice places to live if you didn't need services, if you were willing to deal with a certain kind of informality. And they, bought apartments, rented apartments, started businesses, that kind of thing. And for the most part, didn't integrate that much with the people who were already or who were still living there. And eventually those people get priced out of that, newly cool neighborhood. And then, kind of the next wave of capital comes in and pushes the people who, resettled that neighborhood out. And then this cycle continues at the next neighborhood and the next neighborhood. There's an interesting counterexample that happened before the Second World War in Vienna. Vienna was suddenly being forced to compete on the world market, and they had both falling export prices and rising housing costs due to limited supply. So the city actually bought a third of all the real estate inside the city borders and put up apartments, which they then gave out through